If you are watching this, then at some level, you are interested in understanding how international relations works. And let me tell you, you picked a very good time to be interested in that subject matter. The previous generation of college students that studied this sort of thing, my generation, grew up in the 1990s. And that was a blissful period of time when not much happened of importance in international relations. Yeah, the top thing that comes to mind is probably the fall of the Soviet Union and the creation of 15 new countries, including the Russian Federation. But the Soviet Union was falling apart in the 1980s, so that didn't really change expectations all that much, and this, by and large, at least according to most people, was a positive development. It didn't shape international relations in a negative way, and the negative shaping of international relations tends to be a little bit more important. Of course, if you really wanted to, you could fill out a long history textbook of everything that did happen in the 1990s, and you would be focusing probably quite a bit on what the United States did during that period of time. Washington got a sense of adventurism now that it was unshackled from having to worry about superpower competition with the Soviet Union. But when the United States fought a war in Iraq, or intervened in conflicts in Yugoslavia, or Somalia, or elsewhere, you did not have this greater sense that something happening in one of those locations would dictate the fate of the world, not like you had in previous generations. That sense of stability in the world system sustained itself into the 2000s, even as 8 months into George W. Bush's presidency, the United States got yet more adventurous with its foreign policy. Still, actions in Afghanistan and Iraq felt more like side quests than a true main event of geopolitics. Part of the reason that was the case was that the United States was not getting involved in conflicts with powerful geopolitical foes. Where the United States was fighting interstate wars, they tended to be relatively brief, and where the conflicts really were persisting were more at the civil conflict level. It became more like internationalized civil conflict than true interstate war. And speaking as someone who began his PhD program in 2010, it was not uncommon for researchers of international war to submit articles for peer review, only to get reports back from referees rejecting those articles, because, ostensibly, according to them, interstate conflict is not a thing anymore. That happened in the past, it's no longer happening now, and it won't happen in the future. Such claims were ridiculous back then, but it was what it was. And as a consequence of that, research on international relations, and specifically international conflict, dropped off for a long period of time, as did a broader public interest in those sorts of things. Then February 2022 rolled around, and no one is making the claim that international conflict is no longer a thing. We have a lot more interest in the subject matter. Nonetheless, the world of conflict that we live in today is more complicated than previous generations have had to confront. Indeed, the 2 generations before me grew up during the Cold War, and by comparison, the Cold War was relatively straightforward. You had these 2 nicely organized alliances squaring off against each other. On the right, the Warsaw Pact, the communist countries, and on the left, NATO, the countries united against communism. Meanwhile, the battle lines of today, well, what the heck are the battle lines of today? We probably have a good sense of what the Western coalition looks like, but the other coalition is a bit messy. You have China, of course, which is now regarded by the United States as the pacing threat, the main threat that the United States faces, the main geopolitical competitor, basically the Soviet Union of the modern era. Then you have the junior partner in the relationship, Russia, which is still above a bunch of other countries in the makeshift coalition. Russia is involved in the largest land war in Europe since World War II, and also has its sights set on the eastern flank of NATO. China is not directly supporting Russia in those endeavors. For example, you do not see Chinese soldiers intervening in the war and being active participants. You also do not see Chinese weapons going directly to Russia that Russia can turn around and use on the battlefield. Nonetheless, China is supporting Russia in other ways. For example, by importing Russian crude oil, which is otherwise having a hard time finding a home now that Western sanctions are in place. China also helps out the Kremlin by exporting what are known as dual-use goods. These are the types of things that could be used inside of weapons, but also have civilian uses. China can trade in this way and look by international standards as though they are not, again, directly supporting the war effort, while still implicitly supporting the war effort and making some money in the process. Then you have North Korea. Historically, North Korea and China have had a very close relationship. But in the last couple of years, North Korea has also been getting very close to Russia, and you can see this with the war effort directly this time. North Korea has sent troops to directly intervene in the conflict, and North Korea has no problems directly giving weapons to Russia that Russia then uses in Ukraine. Then you have Iran. Iran, like North Korea, has directly assisted Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war, this time focusing on the export of drone technology. But simultaneously, Iran has also been very busy inside of its region, and that affects the broader conflict with the Western coalition because, of course, Israel is there. Part of this is indirect, with Iran providing materiel support to militant groups that are directly on top of Israel. But part of it is direct as well, with Israel and Iran getting involved in a war, which has also recently brought in the United States to intervene on behalf of Israel. And never mind the extended war along the Gaza Strip that has also been distracting to the Western coalition. There is one more state-like entity involved in this, though, and that is the Houthis in Yemen. They are a longtime ally of Iran, and though technically, at least to some extent, still involved in a civil war over the country, the Houthis have relatively stable control over the western portion of that area, and as a consequence, are right on top of a shipping lane in the Red Sea. This has become very complicated for the Western coalition because that means that the Houthis can target ships that go across that region, which slows down trade or forces the trade to divert all the way around Africa, thereby costing Europe, Asia, and even parts of North America a whole lot of money. That, in turn, has led to interventions from Israel, as well as the United States, which was shortly before the United States intervened in that war between Iran and Israel. So, yeah, this is fairly complicated. And I still haven't even gone into what the United States, and certainly Asia, would consider the main event, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. That could be the true catalyst for World War III. You know, a few minutes ago, I described the 2 generations before mine as having lived through the Cold War. But perhaps that was misleading. Now, a lot of analysts will describe this as the First Cold War, and the world that we are living in right now as the Second Cold War. I personally find this era to be very frustrating to live in, because the public discourse on the situation is horrible. I frequently find myself yelling at the television, not because I politically disagree with what is being said, but because so much is just factually wrong. Perhaps in part because everyone just fell off the wagon, so to speak, about studying these sorts of things because of the 20-year period of relative calm in interstate relations. Whether this is the Second Cold War or not, and whether Ukraine is the new Germany or not, we certainly live in a time when these things matter a whole lot more. And I think it's important, then, that we get the facts right so that we can have an informed conversation about what to do with the politics of the particular situations that we find ourselves in. And yeah, you and I are only 2 people, but maybe you'll go on to do very important things at some point in your life. And if not, there's a good chance that you are listening to this as a voter in a Western country, and your vote may make a difference to some degree in how the political landscape is shaped. So let's learn a little bit more about what's going on in international relations. Now, we have a whole bunch of lectures still ahead of us, but what I want to do with the rest of today is develop a bunch of building blocks for the study of international relations. These will help us out as we go through those future lectures. Think of this as essentially setting the table for what is to come. The top 2 points are going to focus on the real actual building blocks of international relations itself, sovereignty and anarchy, how the system is structured and what can and cannot happen in this system. And then we'll switch to more of the study of international relations. We'll talk about the types of causal relationships that we want to study, not proximate, more like underlying causes. and also what the difference is between politics and political science. It turns out that those things get conflated, and that might be the primary contributor to why the discourse on international relations is so poor. But we're going to start off by talking about sovereignty, because sovereignty defines the international part of international relations. Now, there are a lot of actors in international relations. One category that might immediately jump to mind are intergovernmental organizations, something like the United Nations as an example. These are groups of a bunch of different countries with some sort of underlying structure behind them for them to interact with one another. A subset of these types of intergovernmental organizations would be military alliances, like NATO. Again, a bunch of different countries all grouped together doing something with some underlying structure behind it. Then you might have non-governmental organizations, which do not have the backing of states, and states are not members of those groups, so that might be something like the International Red Cross. The International Red Cross can still affect international outcomes, especially in times of conflict, because of what they do on the ground, but they themselves are not having states as their individual constituents within the group. Another category that has become increasingly prominent in, say, the last half-century is multinational corporations. These are businesses that have multiple divisions in multiple different countries, never mind the fact that they will tend to do business and sell goods to other countries as well. But the primary actors in international relations, and the ones that we will focus the most on, are states. And you can kind of understand why that might be the case based on all of those other groups that I have been discussing. At some level, I was referring to states as I was describing what those other types of actors do. And so you can understand then why we need to focus a lot on what states are in international relations and what they are doing with each other when they are negotiating or they are fighting or they're trying to do business with one another. Unfortunately, this always creates a bit of confusion for Americans. Think about the country name, the United States. Well, in international relations, when we're studying this, when we're researching this, when we're just talking about it, the word that we use to describe countries is states. Inside of the United States, though, inside of the United States of America, the colloquial word that we would use would be country, but in international relations, we describe countries as states. So by and large, if you're used to the word country, that is what we're talking about when we use the word state in geopolitics. The reason that this is confusing is because, of course, in the United States, a state refers to one of the 50 states, like California, like New York, like Pennsylvania, like Georgia, and so forth. However, if you have an understanding of international relations, it will start to make sense why the United States has that word in it, states. Once upon a time, very early on in American history, each individual state in the United States acted similar to how states work in the international system. In other words, to some degree, they were all trying to set their own foreign policies. Over time, of course, that changed. The US federal government became increasingly powerful, and the system in which each individual state within the United States acted like a state on the international system became unsustainable. And so they lost those sorts of powers. That sort of power stayed centralized within the US government, and the word state is sort of at this point just an artifact of an older time period where those states did in fact act like states. Okay, that should give you a basic understanding of what states are in the international system, because in your everyday life, you understand what a country looks like. You know what Ireland is. You know what Germany is. You know what Argentina is. And that's good for having an understanding about what I'm talking about, but it sure would help if we had a better definition of what actually a state is. So rather than giving you examples, we should talk about what a state is and how a state should be defined. Well, the way that we do that is with this key term, sovereignty. Sovereignty is defined as the monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a given territory. So the state is the territory under which the sovereign has the authority, and the sovereign is what you might think of as a government. Now, in practice, this tends to get complicated, because while the government has a monopoly on the use of force, or legitimate force, within its territory, the way that that force actually gets applied is not going to be uniform from country to country, and it's certainly not going to be actually exercised by the head of the government itself. To use the United States as an example once again, you will not see the President of the United States going around and policing the streets of a local city. And in fact, you will not see the President of the United States make the vast majority of decisions as it relates to the use of violence within the particular territory, within the United States. Instead, and this is true worldwide, you tend to have a complicated system of delegation that authorizes the use of legitimate force way down the line. So in the United States federal government delegates that responsibility to the individual states. The individual states will further delegate that down to cities, perhaps, or counties in some cases for more rural areas. And then those organizations, maybe through a city mayor, will delegate that to a police force. And the police forces on a day-to-day basis are going to be the ones that are exercising the majority of the use of force within a particular country. That, again, is how it works in the United States. The system of delegation will vary from state to state in the international system, but it is going to stay true that the head of a government of a particular state is never going to be the one actually using the force on the ground inside of a state. All of this should strike you as fairly intuitive because you have lived in this world for quite a long time, and you have observed these things for yourself. Even if you didn't have a word sovereignty, even if you hadn't thought about this as a monopoly on the use of legitimate force, even if you haven't gone through those sorts of more rigorous definitions that we would want to have as social scientists, you still have been living in the world, and so you see this happening all the time, and you have a good sense of it. But interestingly, this is not always how the world worked. Actually, we only have to go back to the Middle Ages or medieval times to observe that very different system in practice. To help illustrate what went on during that period, on the left of our screen we have the Yellow Kingdom, and on the right of the screen we have the Purple Kingdom. And you can see that there is a nice river that runs down the middle, going from north to the south, so flowing downward. Let's focus just on the Yellow Kingdom for a second to understand how patronage would work once upon a time. In the center, you have the king, nice and big, and surrounding him are his various lords. The lords would effectively own the land nearby them, and they would have serfs or peasants farm the fields, work in agriculture, to produce as many crops as they could. And whatever surplus that was produced would tend to go to the lord. But the lord of the particular area would not keep all of that surplus. Some of that surplus would then go back to the king in the middle. So far, this should feel fairly similar to a federalized system of today. You have people in various localities that have some sort of local government, but ultimately the tax dollars or tax gold or tax pence or whatever the currency is going back to some sort of centralized government. And imagine further, in the Purple Kingdom, to the right of the river, we have the exact same sort of system. We have a big king in purple, and we have a bunch of small lords also in purple. Where this is going to start to feel very different is how all of the local actors inside of the Yellow Kingdom interact with all of the little actors inside of the Purple Kingdom. Let's take a look at the northernmost purple actor that is right up against the river. Remember that the river runs north to south, and that guy up there is a lord of his little area surrounding him. Imagine one day he wants to increase his agricultural output, because that is primarily how he is going to make his money. Well, perhaps one way to do that would be to have an aqueduct come off of the river so that his fields can be better irrigated. Okay, sounds good so far. Doesn't seem like that should be immediately raising any issues. However, again, remember that the river is running north to south. So if you have more water coming off of the river up north, that means there is going to be less water that is draining down toward the south. Think about what's happening maybe for the southernmost yellow actor right along the river as well. For him, he might now be seeing less water coming off of the river, which is preventing his aqueducts from flowing properly, which means he is no longer able to irrigate his crops. That is a major economic problem for him, which means he has a major problem with that northern purple lord. And you can imagine what the Yellow Lord might do in response. He might round up all of his peasants and serfs, give them some armaments, march up north, and try to destroy the aqueduct that the Purple Lord had just created. The Purple Lord is not going to be pleased with this, so he might also round up his peasants as well to defend the aqueducts, or better yet, perhaps if after the aqueducts have been destroyed, the Purple Lord goes down south and starts looting what's going on in that Yellow Lord's area. Sadly, though, this can get a whole lot worse. Remember, each of those individual lords is paying tribute to his respective king. Part of what goes into that is an expectation that in the event of a crisis, the lord can look to the king for protection. So when that Yellow Lord initially went up north and attacked the Purple Lord, that Purple Lord might be concerned about what's happening, and then talk to the king and ask the king for some protection. And of course, the king wants to keep getting tribute not only from the lord that is currently under attack, but also the rest of the lords of his kingdom. And it would be a bad look for the king if the king does not protect that lord, because then the other lords might wonder if they are going to be left high and dry as well later on, which then may stop those individual lords from paying tribute to the Purple King. As a result, the Purple King might go around to each of his individual lords and ask each lord to contribute some number of peasants or serfs to serve in the army, to then march up north and protect the Purple Lord that is currently under attack, or alternatively, have a retaliatory strike against the Yellow Lord down to the south. But now the Yellow King finds himself in the exact same position that the Purple King found himself just a moment ago. You have a Yellow Lord under attack. So the Yellow King might approach each of his individual lords, ask them to contribute some number of individuals to a larger army, and use that larger army to protect the Yellow Lord down to the south. Or alternatively, take that large army and try to invade the Purple Kingdom. Thus, very quickly, we have the Yellow Kingdom and the Purple Kingdom at war with one another, all due to a relatively simple water rights issue between two of the individual lords within those kingdoms. You can see why people might search for an alternative international system that does not have the same sort of problem. And eventually, that is what we arrive at. This on the screen right now is an image of the Treaty of Westphalia being signed. This was in 1648, and it was one of the treaties that ended the 30 Years' War. What happened in the 30 Years' War is not consequential to international relations today, at least not in a large sense that we care about for such an introductory class. Instead, what the Treaty of Westphalia is known for is the creation of what is called Westphalian sovereignty, or, alternatively, the sense of sovereignty that I just talked about earlier. Remember, under a system of sovereignty, the sovereign has the monopoly on the legitimate use of force within the territory. So, in the previous example, the two kings are the sovereigns, and those kings individually have the monopoly on the legitimate use of force within their kingdoms, not going into the other kingdoms, but inside of their own kingdoms. More subtly, this puts the sovereign in a position of responsibility to police and discipline the individual actors within his country from taking actions external, because any sort of external action going into another country violates the sovereign right of the other sovereign. So going back to the map, when the Yellow Lord down to the south had a problem with the Purple Lord to the north, if that Yellow Lord goes up to the north and attacks the Purple Lord, if we are now operating in a system of Westphalian sovereignty, the Yellow Lord has broken the sovereign rights of the Purple King. Interestingly, if the Purple Lord attacks the Yellow Lord back, goes into the Yellow territory to do this, now that Purple Lord has broken the sovereign right of the Yellow King. It has engaged in the use of force on the Yellow King's territory, even though the Yellow King has the monopoly on the legitimate use of that force. That Purple Lord does not have that right. This creates a very different system of conflict resolution. As a starting point, if the Yellow Lord has a problem with the Purple Lord, it is the Yellow Lord's responsibility in a system of sovereignty to first approach the king and say, "Hey, king, sir, I have a problem with what's going on with this Purple Lord up here. You, as the sovereign, are responsible for the interstate negotiations with the other kingdom. I would really appreciate it if you did something to stop this purple lord from building this aqueduct and preventing the water from trickling down all the way to my agricultural fields. And from there, it would be up to the Yellow King to decide what to do. If the Yellow King decides to take action, the Yellow King does not attack the Purple Lord. The Yellow King instead goes to the Purple King, raises this issue, and kindly requests that the Purple King do something to discipline the Purple Lord. Now, what will actually happen in practice varies depending upon how the individual kings feel about the situation. It might be that the Yellow King does not care at all about what's going on in that Yellow Lord's life, and so the Yellow King never even bothers to approach the Purple King about the situation. Or maybe the Yellow King does care about this a lot, and so he does talk to the Purple King. But what the Purple King then does will vary depending on the Purple King's feelings about the situation. Maybe the Purple King thinks that this is a silly situation and the Purple Lord never should have done it in the first place, in which case the Purple King will go to the Purple Lord and force him to stop. Or alternatively, maybe the Purple King thinks that the Yellow King is being serious, and the Purple King really likes that Purple Lord and thinks that there's a whole bunch of value about to be created and wants to protect the Purple Lord and get all of that value. In which case, the Purple King tells the Yellow King, tough luck, we're going to continue on with this process. Well, a war may still happen. The Yellow King may ultimately choose to fight the Purple King. But ultimately, that war decision will be made by the kings and not the individual lords. Rewinding a bit, if the Yellow King told the Yellow Lord, this isn't important enough, it's not worthwhile to have an international crisis as a consequence of this, I'm not going to do anything about it. And then the Yellow Lord follows up by staging an attack to destroy the Purple Lord's aqueducts. The next step is not for the Purple King to go attack the Yellow Lord. Rather, in a system of sovereignty, the Purple King has to approach the Yellow King, tell the Yellow King what happened, and demand compensation from the Yellow King. The Yellow King may then go ahead and discipline the Yellow Lord, maybe take some sort of revenues from what was going to previously go to the Yellow Lord, and then forward them to the Purple Lord to compensate for the lost damage, or something to that effect. But once again, the international relations take place between the kings, not between lords, and not between one lord and one king. One lingering question remains about what happens if a king attacks the other side. So imagine either the Purple King attacks the Yellow King, or the Purple King attacks one of the Yellow Lords. Well, that would be a violation of the Yellow King's sovereignty. Whether the Purple King is attacking the Yellow King or a Yellow Lord, either way, the Yellow King has the monopoly on the legitimate use of force within the Yellow King's territory. So if the Purple King is attacking anywhere inside of the Yellow Kingdom, that is a violation of the Yellow King's sovereignty. Well, what's supposed to happen next then? In other words, who is sovereign over the sovereign? Who punishes someone for violating another country's sovereignty? And the answer is no one. That previous discussion was analyzing what the organization looked like inside of states. Now we're turning to what the organization looks like among states. And as the word on the screen indicates, the structure of the international system is one of anarchy. Unfortunately, this is another situation where our everyday understanding of words could lead us astray. If you and I were having a normal, everyday conversation, and I used the word anarchy, it's anarchy here, you would think of that as a synonym for chaos. Because again, in normal, everyday conversation, that is the right thing to do. That is how the word anarchy works in normal conversation. However, that is not what anarchy means in international relations. Actually, the international relations version of anarchy is built into the construction of the word itself. Take a look at the back part of it. Archy. Where have you seen that before? Perhaps monarchy? What is a monarchy? It's a system where there is one ruler. Well, that's built into the construction of the word monarchy. Monarchy, one ruler. The archy part of the word means rule. Well, what happens if you have a as a prefix to a word? That means the absence of. So anarchy means the absence of rule. Well, you can see why in everyday language anarchy means chaos, because if you have a system without rules, that tends to devolve into chaos. But the system itself, Anarchy, is not inherently chaotic. It allows for chaos to occur, but it also allows for peaceful relations to possibly happen as well. It is all going to depend on how the states choose to interact in a world that is defined by a lack of rule. There is no sovereign over the sovereign, so what are the sovereigns going to do when it is up to them to figure out what to do on their own? Now, fortunately for us, the world is not as chaotic as it might seem. And I know that might sound funny because only a few minutes ago, I got done telling you about how the world is hanging by a thread. But it turns out there is quite a bit of peace out there in the world. Most states, most of the time, are not fighting most other states. It will vary depending upon which study in particular you look at, which might also vary on what is defined as conflict for that particular study or the time period that they are looking at. But if you give me a random state, and then give me a second random state for a particular year, the probability that those two states are fighting one another is less than 1%. That may seem hard to believe given the current influx of conflict that we are seeing. It may be hard to believe if you are watching this from the United States or you grew up in the United States and you experienced a whole bunch of conflict in your youth. But that itself is unrepresentative of the broader situation because it turns out that the United States gets involved in more conflicts than any other state, in large part because the United States is a really big country and has a whole bunch of interests all around the world. It is also very easy to overlook because when you have two countries that are in harmony with one another, that tends not to make the news. What you will see in your nightly news report is something along the lines of Country A starts war with Country B, or Country C issues a threat to Country D. It's those types of things that are newsworthy. Peace, because it is such a baseline, tends not to make the news, and thus we're not thinking about it as much as we should be. So again, Anarchy allows for peace, it allows for chaos, it allows for anything in between. But mostly what Anarchy does is define the rules, or lack of rules, to the international game. And so if we want to try to establish peaceful relations between a couple of countries, Anarchy is going to be a serious constraint on how we might get that to arise. Another way to think about this, which is particularly evocative, is that international relations is more like relations between rival drug dealers or drug cartels than it is like normal intra-state politics or intra-state relations. When one drug dealer or one drug cartel has a problem with a rival dealer or cartel, there isn't usually a police force that you can call to go help you out in that situation. Because if you tried to do that inside of a country, they would probably come and just arrest you. Now, that doesn't mean that cartels necessarily are always at war with one another, but it does certainly change what the structure of relations between those drug cartels can look like. Well, same thing with interstate relations. Let me give you a few examples of this. The image that you are looking at on your screen is the Budapest Memorandum being agreed to. It primarily featured the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, although there are a couple of other agreements that are essentially equivalent involving Kazakhstan and Belarus that have not received nearly as much historical attention in the last few years. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union broke apart, Ukraine still had a whole bunch of Soviet-controlled nuclear weapons sitting on its soil, which in practice meant that the government still in Moscow, this time Russia, was in control of those nuclear weapons, with soldiers loyal to Moscow controlling those nuclear weapons physically. Nonetheless, this created a political nightmare because it is not good if you have Russia controlling nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil and Ukraine not being particularly enthusiastic about having Russian soldiers still sitting on Ukrainian territory. So the Budapest Memorandum is being signed as a part of a much larger agreement where the United States and Russia made economic concessions to Ukraine for Ukraine to give the thumbs up for Russia to remove those nuclear weapons, which again, Russia was in physical possession of and Ukraine had no ability to fire or maintain, to move those weapons back inside of Russia. The specific part of the Budapest Memorandum that matters for our broader conversation about anarchy is that Russia agreed to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity in return for Ukraine shipping those missiles aside and also signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, agreeing to not develop nuclear weapons in the future. Well, that was signed in 1994. Fast forward 2 decades to 2014, and Russia annexes the Crimean Peninsula and starts a couple of shadow wars in Ukraine's northeastern regions. Then, 8 years after that, you have the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That would seem to violate what the Budapest Memorandum said about Russia respecting Ukraine's territorial integrity. Speaking of that 2022 invasion, we live in a world where there are laws of war. And I'm using air quotes when I say laws of war here. The image on your screen right now is the signing of one of the many Geneva Conventions, which attempts to regulate what is and is not allowed in the process of fighting a war. One of the things that it forbids is the intentional targeting of civilians. Russia has been accused of doing that many different times over the course of the 2022 invasion, and in fact, the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for approving operations that did just that. So not only do you have a law that has been violated, you also have a court full of judges that have decided to arrest the leader that is responsible for those crimes. And yet, Vladimir Putin was not arrested after that arrest warrant was issued. Moving away from conflict between states, let's talk about cooperation between states. NATO is the most powerful alliance that mankind has ever created. There are 32 allies in the organization from North America and Europe, and the key provision of the North Atlantic Treaty that created NATO is known as Article 5. Inside of Article 5, it says that an attack against one is an attack against all. And in the event that one of the allies is attacked, they can convene a meeting of the North Atlantic Council to determine that steps need to be made by each of those member states, if there is a consensus, to come to the aid of that country attacked. You can see the appeal here. If you were thinking about attacking one of those 32 allies, you're not actually attacking one of them, you're attacking 32 of them. And moreover, of those 32 countries, you have some of the most powerful military and economic entities on the planet. So it seems like a really bad idea to do that sort of thing. There's a very powerful deterrent effect that Article 5 creates. Recently, there has been a lot of speculation that some of those states might not actually follow through when push comes to shove. Although, really, I should put an asterisk over the word recently, because this type of thing happens every 10 years, and we seemingly forget about the previous incident in the intervening time. You can see the problem here, though. If there is no follow-through, then an attack against one is not actually an attack against all 32. It's an attack on whichever allies decide to put up when the time comes. But if you're only getting a handful of buy-in, then you're not actually getting the true deterrent value out of Article 5, which in turn means that one of the countries in the alliance is perhaps more likely to get attacked. So what happens if you have one of those agreements made, and then later on, one or more parties decides to break the terms of the agreement? Well, your answer might be that we have international institutions that are designed to handle this, and maybe enforce the rules of a particular treaty or agreement. Something like the United Nations, broadly speaking. Or for civilian attacks by Russia, perhaps specifically with that, it might be something like the International Criminal Court. And it is true, those sorts of organizations exist. But when I mentioned laws of war earlier, with air quotes around laws of war, that applies more broadly with international law. Again, law with air quotes. This is where anarchy kicks in and shows a fundamental difference in how laws work in the international arena versus how laws work inside of a state. If, for example, someone robs you or steals your car, you can pick up the phone, you can call the police, you can file a police report, the police can track down where that car went, punish whoever stole it from you, perhaps even return the car to you. If you are in a situation where you have a business agreement between yourself and a partner, and your partner breaks the contract that you have signed, maybe you're not going to be calling the police here, but you can still go to court and sue your business partner and force the business partner to go back to whatever it was that was originally agreed, or perhaps financially compensate you for breaking the contract. This is really good for you in the event of a crisis, but it's even better because the existence of the police force or the court system encourages individuals to never break the rule in the first place. For most of us, when we're looking at contracts, we're not even thinking about trying to break one of those contracts, because if we do, there are going to be punishments associated with that, and we don't want to go down the path where we are facing those punishments. So we just follow through with the rules that the contract wrote down. And that also makes writing the contracts in the first place relatively easy, because we do not have to be super concerned about individuals breaking the contracts, again, because a court system will be there to enforce the contracts for us. However, that is not at all how it works between states. In international relations, there is no phone number that you can call, and then 3 minutes later, the police will arrive, take down a report, and start looking for the individual who has wronged you, arrest them, bring them to justice, and then maybe get some of your property back. That doesn't exist. With the war crimes example, we know where Vladimir Putin lives. He's over in the Kremlin. You don't see a police force sprinting down the streets of Moscow, pedal to the metal, trying to get there as fast as possible, to knock on the Kremlin's door and say, "We have a warrant for the arrest of Vladimir Putin, please come out with your hands up." You don't see that, right? Because if they tried to do that, they would be shot well before they even got to the Kremlin. Similarly, if you have been economically wronged, there are a bunch of court systems out there in international relations that might give you a ruling on that. But again, what separates those international courts from domestic courts is that the international courts really struggle to have an enforcement mechanism to actually have their rulings be put into place. They might say that you have been wronged, they might say that you are owed billions of dollars, but they don't actually have the ability to go find those billions of dollars and give them to you. The first order consequence of this is that the agreements that one makes with another state are worth the piece of paper that those agreements are written on if we're purely looking at the agreement itself. I will not invade you, you will not invade me. Those words by themselves are worth the piece of paper that those words are printed on. If there is no enforcement mechanism, then this gets us absolutely nowhere. So that means that the way that we need to be structuring agreements in international relations has to be aware of the fact that there is no external enforcement mechanism like there are with contracts in a domestic setting. So when we're writing down these sorts of agreements, we need to make sure that they are what is called self-enforcing, that the terms that are written on the page are the terms that the individual actors would want to follow through upon, regardless of what is actually written there. So that is the second order implication of this anarchical world without external enforcement that we live in. You have to be very careful with how you're writing down agreements and how you're structuring agreements. Clearly, because most countries are not fighting most other countries most of the time, this actually does happen and does work out fairly regularly. But we have to be very careful about how we're going about doing it. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a circumstance where the agreements that we have made are not self-enforcing, and they're just prone to violation and perhaps even worse outcomes afterward. Lastly, a critical implication of the anarchical system is that we live in a world of self-help. For larger countries, that means that if you want something done and you want to enforce something, it is up to you to pay the costs to do it yourself. For smaller countries, it means that it is up to those smaller countries to figure out ways to convince the bigger countries to come to their support and aid when it is necessary, knowing that, unlike in a domestic setting, the police are not going to come there just because you called. A large country is not going to come to the help of a small country just because the small country called for help. It is up to the small country to figure out a way to convince the large country that it is in the large country's best interest to do the thing that the small country needs. That's why this is a world of self-help. Again, anarchy is not chaos. It could be chaos, it could be relatively harmonious, it could be anywhere in between. And the game for states to play, and for us as analysts, is to figure out how to structure things in a way that might get us closer to peace and further away from chaos. All right, that takes care of the nuts and bolts of international relations, what states are, and the environment in which they interact. Now I want to pivot to two topics on how to actually study international relations. And the first of these is how to think about causation in geopolitics, and the difference between proximate and underlying causes. Broadly speaking, we as social scientists are much more interested in underlying causes than proximate causes. A proximate cause is effectively the story by which something actually happened. Who it was, when it happened, what it was done with, and so forth. This is very much the type of thing that you would read if you were opening up a history textbook, and indeed it is the type of causation that historians are much more interested in exploring. In contrast, an underlying cause is an exploration of why something was bound to happen or very likely to happen, regardless of the specific circumstances under which it did happen. So maybe it wouldn't have been done by that particular guy on that particular date with these sorts of characteristics. It might have happened 3 weeks from now, 5 months from now, 2 years from now, different person, different resources, something like that, but it was very likely to happen eventually. The reason that we as social scientists are interested in those underlying causes is because it is our job to understand the world broadly, to not only understand what specifically happened in a particular case, but why there are other cases that look very similar to it that had the same perhaps underlying principles that drove both of those behaviors. And that's also very useful for us if we're thinking about what might happen in the future, because we can use the characteristics of what is happening right now or what will be happening in the near future to try to compare that to other historical events that maybe had the same sort of underlying causes. There is a cliche that history repeats itself. That is false. There, for example, will not be another Austrian art school reject who tries to take over the world. That doesn't mean that history is useless to us, though. History can, in fact, be very informative to what's going to happen in the future. The better saying is that history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. What I mean by that is there are going to be similarities to things that have happened in the past to things that might be happening in the future. And just focusing on the past, there are going to be things that are similar in one case and another case. That is why we as social scientists want to figure out these underlying causes so we can make comparisons amongst cases in the past and perhaps eventually apply it to what's happening now and in the future. Thus, to further the analogy, we as the social scientists are looking for the rhyming scheme, and then we can fill in the historical details so we actually have the poem. Note that we as social scientists must then be looking at multiple cases and trying to put those cases together into some sort of cohesive narrative, which is very much in contrast to what historians do. Let me give you an example of the difference between proximate and underlying causes. Imagine that someone died in a car accident. Okay? Well, the proximate story for this, the proximate cause for that individual's death, might be that the person went flying through their windshield and then their head hit the pavement, and they died. Okay? That is true. Imagine that is what happened. Okay? That can be perfectly true. And that's a very good explanation for what happened. If you were trying to write down the historical details on the coroner report, you might note those things. However, that does not really tell us much about what to do to try to solve this problem in the future. There are going to be multiple people who have themselves flying through windshields, crashing their heads into pavement, and dying. It's bloody and it's not good. But that doesn't really give us good advice on what to do afterward, because we're not going to go around telling people, hey, it's a bad idea to get into car accidents, and it's even worse idea to go flying through a windshield and have your head hit the pavement. Technically, that's true, but it's not really actionable in terms of the advice. But let me flesh out this story a little more with a couple of details. First, the driver was not wearing his seatbelt at the time of the accident. Second, he was driving 100 miles per hour in a 50 mile per hour zone. Well, those two details give us some good hints about the underlying cause of the accident. Had he been wearing his seatbelt, he would not have been ejected from the vehicle. Had he been driving 50 miles per hour instead of 100, he might not have gotten into the accident in the first place, and conditional on having gotten into the accident, he might not have been propelled so far and so fast to go through the windshield and have his head hit the pavement. Those underlying factors give us better leverage to compare this particular case with other cases. We might start looking at the universe of car crashes and start finding out that the drivers that are wearing seatbelts tend not to be the ones that are ejected from the vehicle. We might also find out that the people that are driving relatively slowly, conditional on getting into the accident, again, are less likely to die. And that gives us actionable advice to others. Wear your seatbelt, don't speed. Let me give you an example about how to apply this to international relations. The man in the uniform on the right, with the feather-looking thing coming down from the hat, is Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the heir apparent to the Austrian-Hungarian throne on the eve of World War I. And you may be familiar with him because he was assassinated, which then started the July Crisis, which then led to World War I. It is fair to say that the proximate cause of World War I was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Without that assassination, the July crisis doesn't happen, and World War I as we know it does not happen. However, saving Franz Ferdinand does not mean that World War I never happens. It would not happen under those particular circumstances, but there were some underlying factors in Europe at the time that made Europe very vulnerable to a war outbreaking. This is why you might hear the term powder keg, that Europe was in the middle of a powder keg at the time of the war, and this is just what lit the fuse to that powder keg. But it was not the powder keg itself that was asking for a war to happen. A couple of the underlying factors connect to the military situation at the time. For one, on the eve of World War I, military elites believed that the offense would be heavily favored in any confrontation, that the technology of railroads would allow offenses to rapidly deploy to a front line and overwhelm an unprepared defensive trench. And moreover, the machine guns that were being developed around this era would allow the offense to very quickly mow down anyone that stood in their way. So it was super important to be the one that starts the war, rather than the one that is caught flat-footed and taking on the offense and then utterly being destroyed as a consequence. In addition, there were some long-term power shift dynamics that were creating concern in some of the capitals. Here you might have a state growing in power over time, and a declining state looking at the situation and thinking to itself, if a war is going to happen eventually, maybe it would be better if I fight right now while I am still relatively powerful, and before the rising state has completed its ascension to power. Sometimes you will hear Germany cast as the rising state because Germany was growing its military-industrial base at the time. Others will tell you that Russia was the rising state at the time because of Russia's underlying population growth, which eventually would make it much more powerful because it would be able to man a much larger army. Either way, those are dynamics that could recur in other circumstances. We're talking about long-term power shifts, or we're talking about first strike advantages. That tells us something about the world and how we might want to change what the world looks like to avoid circumstances where we wind up in a situation where there might be a long-term power shift or development of military technology that gives first strike advantages. In contrast, if all we are looking at is the proximate cause of Franz Ferdinand getting shot, I'm not really sure what that tells us other than maybe hire more security for important people. Yeah, that's true to some degree, but it's not going to give us as much of a causal explanation that is going to be better applicable to other situations, and it's going to certainly be much more obvious than the dynamics of power shifts and how power shifts affect war. So, all told, that is why we care about underlying causes as social scientists, much more than proximate causes, and you're going to be hearing me talk a lot more about underlying causes, and not so much about proximate causes. So that is what we are interested in discovering as researchers of international relations. But I think we should take a step back and understand the difference between political science and politics. Because increasingly what we are seeing now is a lot of production of politics in the public sphere. So I'm talking about news articles that you might read online or TV shows that you might watch, stuff like that. You'll hear a ton about politics. You won't hear so much about political science. Now, I don't have a good explanation for why that's the case. My best speculation would be that in this era of political polarization in the United States, which started at this point decades ago, but has accelerated over the last decade, there's a lot more incentive to produce politics and a lot less incentive to produce political science. However, the absence of political science in the broader public, I think, is causing us to get worse outcomes on the international stage. So I think it's important for us to understand political science and what political science tries to do for that reason alone. But even if you are someone who is primarily politically focused, it will be helpful to have an understanding of how the world works, which is what the political scientists are focused on, so you can better adapt how the world works to your particular politics. Let me give you an analogy that might clarify the difference between politics and political science. What you'll often hear me say is that political scientists are like engineers tasked to build a bridge. There is a span that needs to be crossed, and so you hire an engineer to figure out how to do it. Well, think about the types of questions that an engineer is qualified to answer about the bridge. For one thing, as a starting point, he might tell you whether it is feasible to build the bridge at all. It might be that the span is just too much of a beast, and so it is not feasible to do. We cannot do it. A bridge is not going to be suitable for this particular area. But conditional on a bridge being feasible, he might further tell you about some of the trade-offs. How many lanes can you have? How tall can the bridge be? How expensive will it be to construct? But what he is not capable of answering is whether the bridge should be built. Should is a question about those trade-offs and how much it's going to cost and whether it is worth it to the person who is going to be paying for the project. That bridge might be worthwhile if it can support 4 lanes of traffic and be done for $100 million, but it may not be worthwhile for, again, the person paying for it if it's only going to be 2 lanes and $200 million. Regardless, those questions are not under the engineer's purview. The engineer is just tasked with building a bridge and figuring out the trade-offs of the bridge, and reporting that information to the person who is ultimately going to choose whether to build the bridge. Now, notably, the engineer does have some sort of veto control over this, because if the engineer says that the bridge cannot be built, that really does restrict the options of the person choosing whether to build it or not. The person is being told, well, you can't do this, then it isn't a matter of throwing money at the problem, it is a matter of physics and a limitation there. But absent that sort of thing, conditional on the bridge being feasible, the engineer cannot answer whether to build the bridge or not. Perhaps you can see where I'm going with this. In the analogy, the engineer is a political scientist. A political scientist is tasked with political questions about what is feasible, what is not possible, and what are the associated trade-offs with conducting particular policies. What a political scientist cannot do, however, is say whether it is a good idea to follow through on a particular policy or not, because ultimately that is going to be a question about a trade-off of scarce resources, which is something that the political actor has to answer. Like an engineer, a political scientist may be able to severely restrict what a politician might want to do, because if a policy is not possible, then the politician cannot really adopt the policy. But the politician is the one tasked with actually choosing whether to do something or not, whereas the political scientist is interested in figuring out whether it can be done and what are the trade-offs associated with it, and how one policy might be better at maximizing some goals, but another policy might be better at maximizing other goals. A succinct version of this is that political scientists are interested in answering questions that begin with can, how, or why, whereas politicians are interested in questions that begin with should. So when a politician comes and asks me for advice about a particular policy, they are not going to ask me, should we implement this policy? As a preliminary, they may ask me whether the policy is feasible. They may also ask me whether there is an alternative policy that would have a similar effect but be better in some way. Maybe it'll be cheaper. They might ask me about the trade-offs of the policy. They might ask me about some of the hidden risks of the policy. But I cannot answer whether the policy should be implemented, because ultimately that is a political decision. Is it worth the cost? Is it worth the risk? Is it okay that one group within the country is going to be hurt by this policy, but another group is going to benefit? Those are all political questions. And certainly I, as a political being myself, might have feelings about those sorts of things. But in my role as a political scientist, that's not my job. My job is purely a just the facts approach, and not having to weigh the trade-offs associated with the political questions themselves. Let me give you a few examples to illustrate what I mean. How about tariffs as a starting point? Imagine you have a politician whose end goal is to bring manufacturing jobs back to the country. And the policy that he's thinking about implementing to do this is to have tariffs be levied against manufactured goods coming in from abroad. That would protect domestic manufacturing industries, allow them to grow perhaps. Maybe some investors will think about starting new companies to build more manufacturing capacity inside of the country, that sort of thing. Well, in my role as a political scientist, I might be able to tell you the likelihood of the success of the policy in actually bringing manufacturing home. I might be able to tell you the types of tariffs that would be best suited for this. I might be able to tell you who is going to bear the direct costs of the tariffs. I might also be able to tell you who is going to bear the hidden costs of the tariffs. What I am not able to do is tell the policymaker whether to ultimately implement the policy or not. That comes with political trade-offs, the cost of the policy, who's actually bearing the costs, the risks, and so forth. That is not under my purview. The best case scenario for me is that I might be able to say, well, given your objectives, here is an alternative policy that is more likely to succeed and will be less costly. So if you want to choose between these two policies, the second policy is definitely better than the first. But ultimately, I still can't tell you whether to implement either of them or none of them, because those are political questions. How about secondary sanctions as another illustration? These are sanctions that do not directly target the country that you were in dispute with, but rather target a middleman, a country that is doing business with the country that you do not like. As an example, how about the United States implementing a 25% tariff on Indian imports to the United States? The United States is not in dispute with India, but the United States is in dispute with Russia, and India is importing Russian oil. So to punish India for doing that, the United States implements a 25% tariff on India, hoping that India will back down from importing that Russian oil. Again, this is very much a political question. The president has to weigh how much damage is going to be done to U.S. consumers as a consequence of this. The United States president is also going to have to worry about the damage to the relationship that the United States has with India. He's also going to have to think about the relative likelihood of success of the policy. So whether to follow through with this type of policy ultimately is a political question and not the type of thing that a political scientist can answer. However, what I can say as a political scientist is something like this. For a secondary sanction to work, the amount of damage that you have to inflict upon the intermediary must be larger than the amount that the intermediary benefits by continuing the policy. Or here, the amount of damage that the tariff inflicts upon India must be larger than the amount of benefit that India gets by continuing to import Russian oil on the cheap. Thus, implementing a half measure is a bad idea. It's unlikely to work while simultaneously being costly to the United States. In turn, your choices are to do nothing or to implement a very large secondary sanction. But I, as a political scientist, still can't tell you which of those two to do. I can say that a middle ground is a bad idea, but choosing between no secondary sanction and a large secondary sanction has to weigh the political trade-offs of the two, and that is something that I am unqualified for. As a final example, let's look at Keith Kellogg's peace plan between Russia and Ukraine. Keith Kellogg is the special envoy to Ukraine, and in 2024, while still a retired lieutenant general, he wrote up a peace plan which is perhaps the best thing that we have as a written document that suggests what the Trump administration might try to do to actually implement a peace inside of Ukraine. So what can I do with this as a political scientist? Well, I might be able to look at that peace plan, think about what is causing the war in Ukraine, perhaps the underlying causes of the war, and investigate whether the peace plan adequately addresses those underlying causes and renders them irrelevant, or at least irrelevant enough that you might have both Ukraine and Russia accept the terms of the deal. I might also be able to point out potential hiccups with it. For example, one of the main components of the deal is that in the absence of Russia complying with it, the United States will massively ramp up aid to Ukraine. Well, for Russia to sign on in the first place, Russia would have to believe that the United States would follow through with that threat. Absent that, Russia continues to fight. So if you want this deal to work out properly, you have to convince Russia that your threat to arm Ukraine is credible. But for one last time, whether to actually do that is a political question full of political trade-offs, and that is not under the purview of a political scientist. Okay, so to wrap things up here today, what we have studied thus far are the building blocks of international relations and the study of international relations. On the first half of that, who the actors are in international relations and what the environment is that they operate under. Then how to study political science, how to study international relations, what sort of causal relationships that we're interested in, namely the underlying causes that try to connect multiple different cases together, and also some of the differences between the study of politics, political science, versus politics itself. Perhaps next time we might start getting into some of the actual interesting political trade-offs that we see in the world and how states try to resolve them. As you may have gathered from today, that is easier said than done. But simultaneously, that's a problem for future us.